I feel like this crazy Environmental Law Institute reading is so different from things you might encounter and needs a little bit of contextualization. But I also think it it models a way of thinking that we should have. We should sort of have this in our pockets. So let me dive in with this fantastic image right there. So why this work is important. And oh my gosh, wait a sec. People on the recording, are you seeing my screen with this like crazy crunch? Sam, you have to text me because I can't see what the heck's going on. Actually, no, people can write in the chat window, I think. What do you have? When I was presenting, could you actually? Oh my gosh, now I have people. Hey Sam, everybody's waving at you. I think what we have to do is, okay, hold on you guys. I have to turn on mirroring. It's not going to work. Hold on. 15 seconds. Sorry, let me just say I apologize. I actually practiced doing this and then realized I'm connected to a different type of external device, and so I'm struggling with that. Oh my gosh, displays. Maybe this is what we need. Mirror Crestron. Okay. Well, we'll try this. Okay. Oh, no. That's not what I want. Hold on, you guys. I'm sorry. Shoot. Oh, gosh. Okay. Sam, I need you to text me again. Are you seeing a view that works? Like, are you seeing a scrunched slide on the right that's like sort of unintelligible? Yeah. Or no, it's a what? Let's see. Not scrunched, just a normal slide. Okay. All right. I'll forge ahead. Okay. Sorry, I apologize, you guys. Okay, let's dive in. And this will be over quickly, so stick with me here. Let me get everyone's attention. I'll dive in. Okay, so novel entities and the GEF. So why this work is important. So the trends laid out in this piece, and I don't know if anyone was tempted. You should at least like skim other parts of this report because there's very little kind of very grounded futurist thinking like this. This is sort of, you know, crystal ball and careful nerds combined. Yeah. I will talk about exactly that. Yeah, no, that's what I'll say for context because they're writing it as if for the Global Environmental Facility, which I'll describe in a minute. But really, you should think of this as business intelligence, right? I mean, I think part of what you should take away from my classes is that everything in the world is fair game as business intelligence because it is, right? Like if you just sort of live entirely inside the Wall Street Journal every day, that's problematic. So this is about saying, like, what the heck is going on in the world? So the trends they're describing and trying to grapple with are huge and important, but they're also specifically big enough that we should expect unintended consequences, right? So people who live in worlds where they talk about design a lot and design as a way of understanding the world and what we are doing or not doing would look at the plastics in the ocean example and say, oh, that's an example of unintended consequences because you didn't have the right design mentality, right? If you're thinking in terms of design, and usually you think like a product or a product or a building, but you can think about a market or a whole system, a whole set of material flows. This is just terrible design and really the absence of it. And so what they're trying to do is step back from these big trends and say, how should we grapple with these trends in advance, right? And we'll talk about the in advance part in a moment. But this is the thing that I think is it's as if human beings are just finally, just as the planet is about to perish, are figuring out that we should think about these things ahead of time. And this is a really crystallized example with something that every single one of us touches, literally, right? We're all walking around with rare earth elements and other technology critical elements like in our pockets or in our laptop bags, right? So like this is, like, I mean, as viscerally available as it can be. And that's why I gave you just this one trend. Partly because they prioritized it up front, but it's also because it's one that we can relate to, both the causes and I think the consequences. So that's the sort of very, very big picture. I will just say, most of us here will go off at times work in industries where there isn't a report like this for the most salient issues, right? So this is kind of a model of thinking. This may be too meta for the day before Thanksgiving, but this is really about a way of thinking more than it is about technology critical elements, right? I want you to be able to think about it that way. So step back and say, how would I understand the bigger challenges associated with particular business and its business model and like what the bigger market that it's a part of, right? I mean, think about how much this is all about things that you know, but no one's talking about, iOS and Android, right? This is about like at a much, much higher level. Yes, there is a higher level than iOS and Android, in case that's confusing. So the focus here is technology critical elements. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. I mean, they list them in a few places. This is maybe exactly what Wikipedia is for. They're just chunks of the periodic table that are, by the way, Sam, don't do anything weird or incriminating because you're right there on the screen. We can actually see you. That's awesome. You smiled. Okay. Sorry. You're fine. You look great. You look like a student model. Like you're describing exactly what a student should be doing. So you're fine.
I'll turn off the camera.
Just make you self-conscious. But I just want to point out, so you have these elements that are everywhere, big chunks of the periodic table. She's going to cover up her screen. But there's been this massive increase this massive increase in production. And like you really should reflect on this. This is really, this is an incredible amount of change, right? And I think it's hard for us to, it's almost hard for us to feel anything when we see a graph like this because it's like every graph looks like this in 2018, right? We've just been through this period of incredible population, and by period I mean like 30, 40, 50 years. It's an incredible period of population growth, economic growth, technological change, and these resulting changes in material flows, and then a few little consequences to the biosphere along the way, right? And so I think it's easy to be numb to this kind of a graph. But, I say here the parallels with plastic, this is just almost too obvious, but I will spell it out. Here we have oceans filling up with stuff that we didn't intend for the oceans because of technological change, economic growth, population growth. And now we're on kind of the same sort of trajectory with these technology critical elements. So just this idea that you'd say, wow, wait, where will all of the crazy elements in these devices, for those of you on the webinar, I'm waving my iPhone again, where are these things going to end up? And that's why you have this great language in there, like how these things can escape to the environment. They're trying to get away. That was some of the language in the report. So I want us just to think about it that way. Like, okay, if we're going to take these things from one place, they're going to end up not just in the places we put them, like the iPhone and the laptop, or the electric car, or the solar panels. They won't necessarily just end up there, but they will escape too. So it's trying to think ahead to just the most obvious unintended consequences. So I feel like this is an amazing sort of model in a dozen pages of how one might grapple with these big challenges. We'll talk about this more in a moment when we zero in on why this is sort of relevant to corporations. I just want to acknowledge not all of us will be, like next year or the year after, in jobs where we have the luxury of grappling with things at this sort of a time scale or at this sort of a scale. I mean, they're obviously thinking very big and long term, though not necessarily that long term, and they talk about how long term now might be 5 years in some ways. So not everybody will get to grapple with this stuff, but it is surely the context in which business happens. Miranda. Sure.
Why is world consumption, why is China separated from world consumption, but then in production, China and the
Yeah.
US are separate? Why is the US separated in both as well?
Yeah, great question. So for those of you on the webinar, Miranda just asked why China and the US are called out separately in here, and production and consumption separately. So I think, first of all, they're just trying to show that this is, it's not spatially diffuse in an even way, right? That it's concentrated in certain places. Part of it is to show, I mean, this is what I read. Feel free to pitch in if you see other things in this graph. First of all, that China has essentially taken over production of some of these things, right? I mean, that's sort of the simple lesson. Where the U.S. had it when it had, most of the world's production when it was small, and now China is the big story. So you see this hope. I think there are lots of places, we have a bunch of lithium deposits in the U.S. and some other rare earth elements that we could dig out of our ground too, though we prefer digging things out of other people's ground. I mean, that seems to be the MO. For example, what is our oil doing under their sand? So that's a bumper sticker, just so you know. That was not necessarily a geopolitical statement. So, but the point here about I think to show this is to say, like, the importance of China, and then the graph as a whole is demonstrating the rapidity of the change that we've experienced. I mean, note these sort of like sketchily even dotted lines proceeding into the future. Those, again, because we are so numb to these things, might not look like impressive rates of change. What you should be thinking about is this level effect that has happened over, a generation or two, where we went from these things being non-existent, at the end of the Second World War, to now being this, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of stuff being dug out every year and put into play, and then therefore potentially into the biosphere in a meaningful way. So it's this move up because of this period of technological change. Adrian, do you see more?
I just had a question. The Chinese consumption, does it refer to Chinese consumers or to local?
Yeah, the latter. I mean, for sure. For sure this is not for the Chinese market yet, though, of course, I mean, that's going to be a growing part of this. Yeah, in fact, you're right. Instead of saying consumption, in some ways it should be like intermediate good consumption or something like that would be kind of the economics term you'd use. That's a good point. But still, I mean, it's misleading from the standpoint of thinking about where the final products end up, but it is useful for thinking about where issues at different parts of the supply chain would be. The extraction and the manufacturing stages are now and for the foreseeable future going to be overwhelmingly in China. That's a reasonable thing to note. Brooks.
How is it that
Yeah, I think that's kind of I couldn't find it in the paper. I looked for this. I think that's either something where you end up not being able to use everything you extract, or there's a lagged effect in your stockpiling. But I don't really know. But then the lines should, because the consumption is higher off in the future. So you're saying, I guess that explains the future. Discrepancies earlier on, I can't really tell you, but after 2015, surely it's exactly what Pete just said, that in fact, we start closing some of these loops. I mean, and it's worth saying, I'll just say right now, if you look at that and think, wow, that's not very much recycling, you should think that. We actually are capable of high rates of recycling in certain cases. Something like 98% of lead in the United States is essentially recycled and back in, because most of the lead we use is in car batteries, like sort of regular, not electric car batteries, which are usually lithium chemistries now, but the like 12-volt car batteries. If you sell batteries as a retail outlet, you must take them back. and you become a point of aggregation, and then there are relatively few places where these things then get recycled, and so we have darn near 100% recycling of lead that way. Yeah, and there are only a few major producers. But it is worth saying that the consumption of lead, so the use of lead, is very, very diffuse, right? I mean, every car, essentially. So a few 100 million places with a few pounds of lead just in the United States. So the point is, if you have systems that make you think about this stuff and channel behavior, you can get ahead of it. And so this is surely a business as usual scenario without a bunch of really awesome policy interventions that we'll come to briefly in a moment. So, yeah, so those are great questions. Any more? I mean, I just want to make sure that we have, I mean, just a general sense of like what we're looking at, and it's really that dramatic change you should think about. So, for context, we definitely need to talk about the Global Environmental Facility. What the heck is this? This is not something most of us are talking about every day. So let me take just a moment. All you need to know about GEF on one slide. So first of all, basic description. This is a collaborative effort of a whole bundle of national governments on environmental issues. I think that's the best way to think about it. Lots of different national governments pay into it and also affect its agendas. This is straight out off GEF's website, established on the eve of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So for those of you too young to remember, in 1992 there was a big meeting convened by a bunch of United Nations agencies in Rio de Janeiro on environment broadly, not specifically on climate, but on environmental issues broadly, and it was sort of created, GEF was created essentially at the same moment because of this recognition that there are some of these problems that we probably can't solve at the national level, even as large national governments. And they have a handful of big program areas, like 7, 8, 9, something like that. 1 or 2 are really just on climate. A bunch of them are on particular ecosystem types, some stuff on the ocean, some stuff on certain terrestrial habitats that are systematically threatened, and then some things on water and some things on chemicals. Very, very high-level program areas. They tend to fund research on things that lead to very, very large projects by other people. The one-liner on climate they have is that the projects that their work has led to will ultimately remove 8 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. If you don't immediately have scale because you didn't take LCA, I should just say that's like, you know, a quarter of human emissions, of anthropogenic, human-caused emissions in a year. So that's just massive scale. As soon as you're talking gigatons, it's a big deal. But that's the whole point, is that they're trying to focus on not local problems, but on things that are best understood and addressed at a global scale. But that said, there are going to be some things that relate to individual businesses, so more on that in a moment. So why is GEF relevant as a frame of reference? They worry about these things at scale, at essentially the largest scale you could. Note in the paper they talk about shaping outcomes in the science and technology space. Shaping outcomes, right? They're trying to change the rules of the game. They're trying to change the general trajectory of science and technology. That is not like something you do for fun on Saturdays, right? I mean, this is a big job. And in this case, they want to promote action ahead of time. The specific language spoke to me. Opportunities to impact technological development before the lock-in effect occurs. And we'll have a little bit of an activity where I'll want to just like dig into your brains briefly and think about some of these things where we have developed a dominant form of production and consumption, where we have just ways of doing things that shape everything that we do. I think I complained earlier this quarter, I think in spring as well, it's an ongoing theme. Our dishwasher. Oh, I have to replace the dishwasher. Got the most reliable brand, and we got a lemon. It's just not fair. But has anyone here ever installed a dishwasher? So have you ever noticed how there's basically one shape of dishwasher? There's one set of connections for dishwashers. There's this interesting technological standard that has developed, and you can imagine very easily that you don't diverge from this, right? Because then no one has a shape of hole in their kitchen where your dishwasher will fit. It'll either be too big or too small. And you don't want to have different connections because it's hooked up to electrical and plumbing. And so like there's this lock-in effect, even for something as mundane as a dishwasher. And that's actually quite profound when you think about how much of consumption is sort of channeled into certain formats. And you can end up doing things in certain ways over and over and over again. And by doing things, I mean not just the consumer washing dishes, but the company producing dishwashers. You have an entire business ecosystem around dishwashers that are a certain number of inches wide with certain electrical and water connections. And so you think about that metaphor for GEF, they're thinking, wow, we really want to act before we get to the point where technology has dragged us into certain lock-in effects, and there we are, forever using batteries with particular elements in particular ways. They're manufactured so they can't be recycled, or manufactured in ways that they can't be easily collected, or some other unintended consequence that you'd look at and say, the absence of design once again, right? So I think that's, for me, one of the biggest lessons here. And I think actually the business world is very gradually waking up to this sort of thing. Although everything I just said sounds like policy thinking or sounds like academic thinking, you can see how big a deal this is in the business world, because this is going to shape a lot of your opportunities. So before I say more about the business world, which I will for just a few minutes, I think this graph, all of their graphs, I think if you stare at long enough, you will start to smile and realize each one is profound. But we'll just smile at this one today. So this is, I think, figure 1 out of there. So notice a few different things. Let me just narrate a couple. So first of all, note that process innovation and product innovation are different. Like you conceive of the product first, and then as this gets disseminated and more companies scale and more companies start doing the same thing, you get a lot more process innovation. You get better at making more and more of things. And notice that it goes from fluid phase to specific phase, right? Surely, once upon a time, I didn't look up the history of dishwashers for this lecture, but one could go back and surely find a whole bunch of different dishwasher shapes and sizes. So that was the fluid phase. Now we are very much in the specific phase for dishwashers. We're pretty locked in to a particular format and particular supporting infrastructure. So notice that happening on the y-axis, just as this innovation intensity is changing for product and process innovation. And I'll just say, like, note the effort to identify the most effective change opportunity. That's hard, but GEF has tried to make its impact space earlier on during the fluid phase, before all of the process innovation has taken place, ideally, and maybe when still a bunch of the product innovation is going on. And I would say, again, to harp on a couple things, notice the use of innovation intensity as an axis. I think that's interesting. It's not the same as scale. It's like how much change is going on that is defining the system. Right? That's the innovation. It's like, what kinds of products are we going to have? What features will they have? What technologies will they use? What rare earth elements will they need? Those are the things happening during product and process innovation. And so, obviously, that's earlier on at the fluid phase. And then the last phrase that I think is kind of fun, that we'll build on very briefly for the activity, is this notion of the emergence of dominant design. So the dishwasher of standard dimensions and characteristics, that dominant design emerged quite a while ago. But that's the key thing that you're looking for. You want to influence things before dominant design fully emerges, because then you are locked in. Or maybe you're not fully locked in, but it's really hard to change the dominant design. Pete, you had a question.
This is really interesting what you're trying to do here. You're trying to basically predict in some ways what innovations in process could or could not help significantly in the design of a product. So that, I think, is first of all a challenge. So maybe for example, in the dishwasher case, they were too late to recognize that the standardization of dishwashers wasn't the greatest situation, but there was a lot of excess, for example. Too much But now, you've got these incredibly efficient dishwashers that don't really have that big of an impact. So maybe if they had an impact earlier on in the product innovation phase, that there'd be different sizes and stuff like that, you wouldn't have received so much intense process innovation that helped with efficiency of water use. So that I find really interesting. And the other thing, are they receiving grants to do this work?
GEF?
Yeah.
I mean, you should, yeah, think of this as all like research funded by directly or indirectly by national governments via GEF. I think that's where it comes from. Why are you thinking like, where's the business side of this, or?
No, I think it's just an incredible challenge.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah, and the challenge should definitely strike us. I don't know. So for those of you on the webinar, I'm realizing you won't have gotten Pete's audio. Difficult for me to sum up, but he's just noting that. Well, how do we sum up Pete's point? That's hard. I mean, just your point about the dishwasher that we. Well, go ahead.
You're kind of trying to predict the future. You're trying to.
Oh, you're entirely trying to predict the future. I mean, I think that's what. Well, and I think the only place. I mean, in all of this, it should strike you as like. Yeah, but how? Right? It should be your reaction. How do we get in there and understand this problem, define it well enough to intervene? I mean, I considered expanding the amount of this document that I had you read, but the more it went on, the less I understood. So like some of the nanotech stuff is like really hard to wrap your brain around the implications. If you're into nanotech, you should totally read those sections. But they're very challenging, and like without a certain level of science literacy, that certainly I was struggling with. It's hard to grasp. I think it is hard to predict the future. Notice one thing, which I think is a little bit of humility in this graph. They don't start all the way over at the vertical axis, right? They're not saying that we are there in the labs as the very first things are invented and we understand, and then predict the future and channel it in the right direction, right? They don't say that. It's obviously early stage. They're still trying to get to stuff in the fluid phase. So they're acknowledging that they could be early to the game, even if they're not there at the inception of some of these things. But I would also say for a piece of grant-funded research I'm doing, I'm part of a group that's working on a bunch of different projects that are, some of which are about blockchain, and some of which are about the digital or sharing economy, and all linked to energy and the environment. And just defining the space is a challenge. Like, what are those connections? And I think that's really why you see this. I mean, I will just say, like, there are many terms in this document that I kind of understood, but they're labels for categories that I realize are not populated in my brain. And so I think that's one of the hard things, is when, I mean, imagine not just going and trying to have the crystal ball like this, but being able to describe it to people enough to shape the way people are thinking about the world so you can affect business and policy. That is a big challenge. So it's the crystal ball and then some. Sarah?
I'm struggling to understand what's happening here. Isn't this what like major tech companies are already doing? Like trying to.
Oh, it's a great question. So Sarah just said, like, isn't this what tech companies are doing? So let's distinguish the task here from what an individual corporation is doing. Like, what is GEF-funded research going to try to do, and then what is a tech company going to try to do? What does a tech company want to do?
They want to have sales, so.
They want to own the market.
Right.
Right. They want to define the market. They want to create a new market.
So
even. Yeah.
the grant funding will go towards more like Samsung and.
Well, I would say, I mean, again, I'd sort of ask you to be so disciplined that you pull back from individual companies and think about what GEF is trying to do. They're not, this is not the same as trying to have a lot of sales. This is pretty different. Ness and then Pete.
Can we think of this as sort of like creating an open source ideology? Right, so it's not.
Yeah, so Ness just said, could we think of this as having an open source ideology? I don't know if ideology is the right word. I mean, yeah, that sounds a little too political, but yeah.
That are behind
yeah, I think.
Ideology, because it can't, like, open source or like.
Yeah.
Right? It's like everyone has access to the software, use it as you may.
Yeah.
So I think that whole concept applies.
Yeah, I think what they're attempting to make open source, and open source is a good metaphor here. I think what they're trying to do is to have a problem definition in people's minds before a problem gets away from us, right? So if you think about, I mean, how many people remember the effort to rein in computer and electronics waste starting like in the early 2000s? Okay, a bunch of people nodding. So the thing that really got that going in the US was pictures of dumps, basically, mainly in China, elsewhere in East and Southeast Asia, of just a village where people had brought 100,000 monitors and desktop, you remember desktop computers, like a bunch of those, and they're being like pulled apart and recycled or processed in totally unsafe, polluting ways. Right? There's one great picture where a woman is standing near a vat of lead, like it's being heated so it can like be molten, and she's stirring it so they can pour. I mean, it's recycling, but I don't recommend I'm certainly not going to volunteer my daughters for that activity on the weekends. So the pretty unsafe conditions. And so, but the thing is, that's a great example of where you have, this piece of the economy with a bunch of stocks and flows, and then stuff ends up someplace not because it was part of a design, right? This was not the intention. It was very much the unintended consequences. And so, what they're trying to do here is get ahead of those things and say, whoa, 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 how do we define the problem well enough? And I think this is the open source piece. How do you have shared understanding among a variety of different actors, certainly in the corporate world, certainly in the policy world, probably among NGOs as well, people who do pure science, have that problem sufficiently well understood that people can, en masse, step back and say, okay, what are the big solutions that we need to implement? And have people from different angles working on those big problems. So that's what the human race has been, what's today, Wednesday, terrible at, right, forever. So, this is the whole reason we have the phrase unintended consequences is that we don't particularly foresee those things. But back to final comment, back to what Sarah said about this, well, why the hell aren't the tech companies doing this? I mean, the tech companies are up to their eyeballs in change and competition and I don't know whether you want to call it just market pressures or greed or whatever, but they've got their hands full, and I think it's a lot to ask them also to design a better world at the same time. And occasionally, I think companies do realize, oh wait, there's some strategic advantage. So those of you who took LCA, who did who did Apple partner with to deal with a big part of the carbon footprint of their laptops? Remember? We talked. No. Does anyone remember this from LCA? What is the single biggest piece of the percentage of the mass of my MacBook Air? What's that? No, that's probably the most toxic part, but it's not the part that weighs the most. No. What? The aluminum. You remember Apple went to Alcoa and said, okay, here's the deal. Why can't we get recycled aluminum at better cost? And basically, Apple funded R&D there. So that is literally the only example. I'm an obsessive watcher of the sort of tech and environment space, and that's the only example I can give you of a company actually doing that sort of and acting like the Global Environment Facility. But
doesn't this all kind of get solved if you just incorporate closed-loop products?
Yes, there may be work to do, and not everyone's on board with that, right? So, I mean, yes. So you go out, and by next week, this can count for your final project. Get everyone to sign on to circularity, and we'll be done. No, but I guess this is what I'm saying, right? I mean, markets don't generate those outcomes as a matter of course.
Seems like,
for those of you on the webinar, Sarah's acting disappointed. But yes.
It seems like redundant efforts if you just we can make a coalition and. So I love what you're saying in the sense that I don't love the part that's naive, but I love the part that is no. But I'm just saying, yes, you're right that people should think about policy. I mean, people you should think ahead. I mean, if there were any theme that ran through my classes, this is it, right? That we should, as businesses, learn to think about the ways in which we are parts of systems that ultimately will be so bad that we will have to change the rules of the game. that we will have to alter what is acceptable market behavior. And so absolutely, we have to think that way. But I think almost by definition, business is going to struggle with that sort of thinking, right? It is, I mean, it's a little naive to be like, well, we just incorporate those things. But actually, it's a continual struggle to get that thinking into businesses because competition and, you know, the need for profits and changing markets are all bearing down on them at the same time. But it's a great.
Like that's like on the front end, like and prevent or like have better processes up front or on the back end. But I'm naive, so I will.
Well, hold on. Don't make me go back and lower your LCA grade. You don't close loop it on the back end. You close loop it on the front end. Closing a loop is first and foremost a design question, not an end of life stage question. Okay. For those of you on the webinar, Sarah assures us she knew that. Pete, last comment, and then let me move on.
A good way to think about this and why it's a unique scenario, why it's like open source, it's slightly different. Basically, you're separating fiduciary duty and stakeholders while also having like third-party unassociated funding, which creates a unique situation where you literally are being paid to make things the best they can be for the environment. It doesn't matter really if the product, I mean, you need the product to be successful.
Sure.
Implementation make any difference, but that's kind of the way I wrap my own head.
Well, no, that's a great comment, and it fits nicely with what Sarah said. I mean, I think the problem is in really the way you just described it, because you bundled these two huge tasks as if they're one. Like one is thinking about making the products the best they can be for people on the planet, and the other is making products. And each of those is such a colossal task that we shouldn't be surprised that these end up residing with different people, right? It's hard. I mean, like as much as companies that are ahead of the game in general, and Apple's website is a great example of this, they talk about everything as if like people on the planet are right there in every design process. There's so much caring. I mean, they have to take these like not 10 but like 20-minute breaks to go hug trees in the middle of the iPhone design sessions. I mean, you get that impression from looking at the website, but we know that these companies, that tech companies in general, have really struggled to incorporate these concerns, and that we're still living with the unintended consequences. Because product design in the tech space is so fast-changing and difficult and cutthroat, and thinking about these challenges at this scale is so challenging and daunting even. Okay, Adrian, the last word.
So basically, the best case is them identifying potential, I guess, externalities for the businesses realize them, then get policymakers to ban them.
Yeah, or yeah, maybe not before the businesses realize them, but before the businesses want to think about them. The businesses may realize, but yes. So yeah, so in the webinar, Adrian said like maybe the best case scenario for these guys, for GEF, is to identify negative externalities, big, looming social, environmental, health problems ahead of time, and to let business, and to, I would say, influence business, and especially influence policy. I think that's right. And I actually appreciate the discussion where you guys are trying to figure out, wait, who the heck is doing this? And at what stage? I think that's tricky. And this is very removed from, this is so removed from the nitty-gritty business realities that brands are not mentioned, like whole sectors barely get mentioned. You can barely find the word lithium in here. I mean, like, which is astonishing given how big a metal that is. It's like it's sort of pulled up to this very high level and looking at the problem that way. But at some point, they have to communicate with businesses. Okay, let me do one more slide, and then I want to get us to a quick activity. So technology critical elements. You see this TCEs. I literally have never seen TCEs, had never seen it anyplace else, but you can Google and find a little bit of it. I want you to think about the consequences of extraction. Those are described in here. There's even this, like, how many hectares of land are essentially razed, and whatever biological activity there is either destroyed or dramatically disrupted in order to get 1 ton of this stuff out. You have this consequences of use and end-of-life outcomes. I told you I love that line. TCEs can escape into the environment in a variety of ways. It's as if you open the wrong fissure in your iPhone, out they will go. But actually it is kind of like that. Maybe not airborne, but certainly things get out into the biosphere. And so, You have these consequences of these things, neither of which is essential to, and maybe not even being considered by, the people designing and producing the products, right? They're trying to make a phone, right? They're trying to sell a phone. So, yeah, there's some stuff upstream and there's some stuff downstream, but that's not the point. And that's not going to show up when you select your Verizon plan and you grab a new phone. There isn't anything there about that. It's like, so this stuff is really, externalities, the word that Adrian uses, is definitely the concept here. And then, fortunately, there is still this range of policies for governments to consider. I won't go through those, but you saw them. And they're on page 11, and they're very high level. That field of bullet points about like what policies we could have. I want you to take away a lesson and then a mega lesson from this. The lesson is there's stuff you can do to shape the marketplace to get different outcomes, right? That's the basic idea. I mentioned that with something as simple as lead, right? We have a way to do that. If you sell car batteries, you must accept car batteries. If you accept the car batteries back at the end of their lives, they have to go to an appropriate place for some sort of recycling. And there you go. You set up those rules, you figure out that system, and all of a sudden the world is a different place. And the lead is not escaping into the environment in a variety of ways, or very little of it is.
The value is within the companies that are producing.
Yeah, so Pete just said the value is within the companies that are producing it. And I would say that also you make these things more valuable by having them collected and aggregated, right? I mean, one of the classic problems with a lot of byproducts is individually, like my iPhone battery is valuable. It has elements that are valuable, but you can't use it if you only have a kilogram or 100 kilograms or a ton, right? You need a lot of it for it to be like really valuable in a business sense. So aggregating things, having systems that force the aggregation of these things so they're not waste streams, they are feedstocks for the next process, is an essential challenge. But that list consists of things like that, of those interventions in the marketplace. So that's the lesson. I think the mega lesson is not a policy lesson, it's a business lesson. And that is that one should be able to look at these things, at these circumstances, and be able to step back from one sector in a given moment and say, oh, wow, it looks like we are potentially a part of this problem with technology critical elements, or this problem with nanomaterials, or whatever it is on that list that you see in this document. Step back and say, okay, there's probably some enlightened self-interest here where if we understand this problem before other companies in our space, not policymakers, not environmental activists, not academics, but other companies in our space, maybe we can be a part of defining the rules of the game. So they are better for everybody, people, planet, etc., but then also better for us because we will be in on the ground floor of that definition, but we will be part of that solution. That is trickier. I mean, that's hard to do, but if you can do that, there's obviously value, right? So this is why you see, I mean, even simple things, companies signing on to saying, we are still in the Paris Agreement, right? They're saying, no, we still believe in climate protection. A lot of those companies are into that because they realize, actually, they have a bunch of the products that will do better in the marketplace in a carbon-constrained economy, right? So that doesn't make them like sneaky, greedy bastards. Maybe greedy, but maybe they just realize, wait, no, we're part of the solution. So yeah, change the rules. Like, make it a carbon-constrained economy because we'll do better. We have a competitive advantage in that world. So similarly, think about how as the world is wrestling with these big issues that are a lot for policymakers to take on, right? It's hard. Doing policy is hard. It took us until this year to get Lyft and Uber back in Eugene. Policy is so hard. So if it's that hard, but you as a business see the guts of some of these problems, then you should get out there and try to affect the way the solutions roll out. I mean, and ideally, I'm hoping you'll do it in a way that's better for people on the planet. But it could also be good for the company to be part of the solution along the way. Brinker. Yeah, so the question, webinar folks, that Sarah asks is whether Sustainable Apparel Coalition is an example of that. Yeah, yeah, and it's tricky because like the apparel problems had already gotten pretty bad, so it doesn't feel too preemptive, but I think a lot of the pre-competitive efforts we looked at are versions of this convened by the private sector. Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil is as well. They're sitting there saying, wow, this is this big problem. It's getting worse and worse. We're all part of this problem at different parts of the value chain. How do we define the problem and then lay out a solution, as slow and wimpy as their solution may have been? But again, I mean, even with palm oil, as much as I despise palm oil, it's really the mainstream palm oil, the I don't know where it came from palm oil that's the problem. You know, the meta lesson on Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil is really we don't know whether they're changing fast enough. So maybe they are. Maybe it is a great example of this. It's hard to say. But in both cases, Sustainable Apparel Coalition and Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, it is kind of like this in the sense that they're pulling back and creating collaborations that look more like policy than they do like individual company behavior. I mean, like, you guys actually should step back and think about it that way, right? Like, the stuff that they're doing, RSPO and SAC are really, it's more like policy. It's more like oversight and rules than it is like competition, which is why we treated them in the place that we did, as pre-competitive efforts. Pete?
I think instead of thinking about it as coalitions and initiatives, it's better that many of us go into a business setting where we maybe realize that there's a problem developing with our product or with our process, even if we recognize that our company may not have the resources to solve this problem, we start looking for other companies that we can partner with or acquire to solve this problem. So like Yurtle is maybe an example.
Yeah, so just so there isn't so much dead air on the webinar, I apologize, webinar folks. So Pete said, I think it's a really great way to put it. He said, if you sense these things developing, these problems rolling out in your sector, find other people to collaborate with. I think actually that's a really good instinct by itself, in part because these problems, as we're looking at them here, are not solved at the level of an individual company. They're just too big. So almost by definition, there's going to have to be some sort of, you know, multilateral thing, some sort of collaboration that's much broader than an individual company. I had just a few bullet points, but you guys really all talked about much more than this. But I'll just say something about how it relates to business, and I mean not just the technology critical elements. So solutions identified at scale will shape or even just plain define the marketplace. I think we should acknowledge that. Maybe you'll be able to get away with murder for a while, but at some point these big problems have to be reined in, either by these collaborative efforts among companies or by policy or both. I mentioned here CFCs, which stands for, extra credit pre-Thanksgiving, anybody? Chlorofluorocarbons is too easy, okay. Well, so CFCs are in the process of being phased out because of the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And I would say greenhouse gases are maybe not hot on their heels, but I think we know there's some risk there if you have the carbon-intensive business model. So this is the same sort of thing, right? We don't set out to emit GHGs. We use fossil fuels because they're incredibly useful. And we didn't set out to destroy the ozone layer. We used chlorofluorocarbons because they have a bunch of properties that make them awesome, right? So are you laughing about chlorofluorocarbons? But I mean, there's so many funny things to say. I mean, like, we had vital uses of CFCs that advanced humanity's most noble objectives. For example, the CFCs in cans of whipped cream, right? Yeah, exactly. Now it's other stuff in there, but I'm just saying, hairspray, yeah, CFCs and hairspray, big deal. But the point is, those are sort of like absence of design gone awry, and those are examples where we have identified the problem and are trying to rein it in. And then, you know, by implication, corporate strategy should take a look, and you guys said that in a variety of ways already. So that is all I had on this one. We should move on because it's already 3. I didn't mean to go on so long, but you guys had great questions. Ness, you get the last word on ELI
GEF, and TCEs?
I'm wondering philosophically about trends in general. So is the GEF, is part of their role to shape trends in particular? I mean, I know it kind of is, but also like how much are they taking cultural and maybe industrial trends into account as they are shaping further growth?
So Ness is veering into the big picture, I think helpfully. So is GEF, I mean, let me try to ask you a question a different way. You're asking about GEF and trends. Are they trying to change science and technology, or as they say, or are they really trying to change culture and consumption? I think that's maybe the way to bookend this, right? These two things, because one is like, oh no, this is like science, it's technology, but this is all. I mean, like I'll hold up the iPhone again. This is part of. I mean, this is now like a focal point for consumption. It is a focal point for lifestyle. It's, I mean, how we not just, like call each other, but how we communicate, how we experience human life, how we order more stuff to make us happy. I mean, this is, like, it's important to say that those things are difficult to tell apart when you get in deep. The way this document is written, it's not about culture and consumption. It is about science and technology. But I think that's worth pointing out, and I think that's a great way. Just that tension is a great way to put a bow on Sarah's question without actually answering it. In the sense that, like, how do you? I mean, have we heard from some of the tech companies that maybe people are addicted to devices and we need to address that? Have we heard that? No, we have heard that. Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, has definitely said things about that. Other people have said that. Did the companies respond by ending sales of devices until they were sure that everyone was going to be okay? Okay, Pete's citing the Screen Time app, or for that matter, Flux, that allows you to change the wavelengths so your brain's not being fooled into thinking it's 5 a.m. when it's actually 11 p.m. So yeah, sure, they're nibbling away at this, but nibbling, right? And so I think that actually, I think just that dichotomy that I turned Ness's question into is the challenge in a lot of ways. That, like, I keep using the words policy and policymaker because I want to point out how solving those big problems, thinking about society's well-being broadly, is often a very difficult thing to cram into the business process. And so we just need to be really humble about when businesses enlightened self-interest will deliver awesome outcomes, and then when it will fall short.
Those outcomes, I'm wondering, like I would ask any company, how are they measuring their impact? Like, since this group has been around, are they actually able to understand how much their work is influencing all these different markets?
Yeah, so Ness asked, like, has this group been able to influence different markets? I think this way of thinking is pretty new, probably hard to judge. Other GEF stuff, I think, is around much more clearly defined problems than these. I mean, even just think about the rate of change of the ways in which the TCEs are being used, right? I mean, just how quickly product cycles unfold, how fast the technology is changing, how we've had. I mean, imagine if you had decided, okay, in 2006, we're going to define. We can see it coming. We already have lithium battery chemistries. We already have people moving toward, away from desktop computers toward other things. We're going to define the problem and shape policy starting in 2006. So then we would have completely missed the smartphone and the tablet, which essentially did not exist in their current form in 2006. It's tough to define the problem when it's changing that quickly. So I have no answer in terms of judging GEF's work in this area yet, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll see, but I hope we don't wait too long. Okay, enough on that. Here's the quick activity we're going to do. And I was going to put you in your urban mobility groups, because I'm going to chat with a couple of them when you finish the activity. So 2 things.
Dominant standards, remember, emergence of dominant standards. You're going to make a list, you only have to do two or three. That's all. That's what I mean by a list. The shortest possible list, still a list. And then estimate the stock of certain objects, and then comment on that estimate. And I'll say more in a second. So the very short list of few dominant standards. So describe a product and its characteristics. Do not focus on individual brands or companies. You only have to come up with two of these, but I want you to describe it. And then we're going to make the car. So you kind of did the dishwasher already. You may not select the dishwasher, obviously. Oh, come on. Let the record show that someone sounded disappointed at that. So the car. What's the dominant standard? I'm saying this because it's been really hard for companies to sell cars that don't look quite like current cars. Okay, a certain width. Well, why? Why does width matter? That's dumb, Pete. That doesn't matter. Cars don't have to be a particular width. Why? Are there any parking spaces out there? Yeah, there are a few 100 million parking spaces. So like, there's already something that is predetermining the convenient width of a car. I would say maybe even more important than parking spaces, because you can restripe, roads. Just saying. But yes, so width is probably one characteristic. Brenna? 4 wheels. Does anyone remember the Aptera? VC-funded 3-wheeled vehicle. Oh my gosh, I wanted one of those so badly. Company went belly up. Yeah, I realize there's a 3-wheeled vehicle seller here in town. Well, they have not yet failed to go belly up forever. We'll see what happens. Well, yeah. So like, but I think the fact that, no, but actually, I love that Brenna immediately pushed back. She was like, that's not a car. But that's the point. It's like, even if it's hard to define, you just know it's not quite a car. Yeah, it's actually more like a motorcycle in some ways. Other essential characteristics of this dominant standard. Yeah, Elena.
How the door opens, like the form of the door and how they open.
How the doors open. So there are at least 2 of those. There's like this. I mean, the doors open, and then there's this. And then Brenna just made the Tesla Model X gesture. Has anyone seen the... Okay. Hey, stop flapping your wings and laughing. Okay. What was that? It's Silicon Valley, not silicone, but yes. Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. I was just insensitive to a Canadian. Duly noted. Sam, I hope you heard that. I'm really sorry. Coming over the border is hard these days in America. So, like, let me just say, so like, how the doors open. Well, I don't know. Let's critique. I think Elena gave us something concrete there. Is that part of the standard or not? Some nods, some head shakes.
I think it's yes, because when this car with like single doors, it failed because of these doors. Because it was impossible to open it like when you are on a parking lot.
Okay, yeah, no, that's right. Well, but actually, even to Elena's point, has anyone actually seen on the Tesla website how they show the doors, those doors open in the Model X?
Yeah, but
I mean, they show it in a garage, right? But the point is, the garage is part of the specs of the dominant standard. So they're saying, no, it's okay. This dishwasher still fits. Right? That's what they're doing. So when you think about it that way, so in your groups, come up with just 2 examples if you can and write like a couple of sentences, because I think it's a good exercise. And then second, if we have time, honestly, we're not going to have time for this, but this is what I want you to do, is to make a back-of-the-envelope estimate of the stock of a particular product class in 2025 or 2030. Like, without real intervention, how many smartphones are there in the world in 2030? Raise your hand if you know someone. Doesn't have to be you, it could be, but it could be somebody else. If you know someone who has an extra smartphone that's not being used. Does anybody know someone? Extra smart. Okay, so boy, those hands went up slowly, but it was a majority. You're pointing at me. You can't use me as an example. But I'm just saying that this is part of the, yes, it's true. Do you remember what it's called? My daughters call it the night-night phone, because it's like, you use it for like background, like white noise or music, and to go to bed too. Anyway, it's a very expensive way to generate that sound. But the point is that that's again the absence of design, right? Like, you have stuff that sort of drifts down in usefulness, and then you have it, and you don't want to throw it away, but like you still have it. And so there are lots of, this has happened with personal computers as well, typically. I mean, we've now dealt with a lot of the backlog in the US, but it used to be the case, like you go back 8, 10, 12 years, and there was a massive stock estimated in people's garages and closets of old dead computers. So I guess I want you to think about it that way. You could just do one product. But I think the key point is the third bullet point, sub-bullet there, the sensitivity analysis. You know, just in a nutshell, what could you do to change that business as usual scenario so you don't end up with a world with 25 billion smartphones? Okay. Let me break there. I will ask you to groupify and pick away at this, and you can do it pretty quickly online. And I mean, yeah, the activity's been created. And then I will also be available through the end of class and for a little bit after that to talk to people about urban mobility groups, because you'll be pre-groupified. And other than that, happy Thanksgiving, and I will sign off online.